Welcome to the Skeptical Auditor Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Hernan Murdock. Today on the show, we are joined by Chris Ward, IT governance expert at IT Pro TV. Chris has a long and distinguished history as a practitioner and instructor with many certifications achieved over the years. In this episode, we talk about what IT governance is all about, the benefits of curiosity and broadening one's horizons through exploration, reading, and pursuing professional certifications. Also, the importance of communication skills for success in IT and audit. All that and more, starting now. So let me start with an interesting question because one of the things that I like to do is to better understand the person, right? We spend a lot of time talking about the technical subjects and how we have this expertise and certification. And we'll get to some of that later. But I would like to begin by just getting to know you a little bit better and how that has influenced you. So where were you, where did you grow up? And how did that experience shape who you are today and your career?
I pretty much grew up in a lot of different places. I was born at the Naval Academy, so I am a Navy brat. My dad was a assistant instructor at the Naval Academy, and then he was an actual instructor at Great Lakes Naval Station in just north of Chicago. So yeah, we spent a lot of time both coasts, from California back to the East Coast. Spent a lot of time, obviously, just outside of Chicago. But growing up, military family, so very familiar with, when we talk about governance and when we talk about policy and procedure and process, obviously a very big part of what I grew up around, but mostly the people. Plus, my dad was a fire control chief petty officer, so he had served in Vietnam several times, and so he was always had computers around the house. Because of computers going in there, he actually had a chance to meet Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who's the one who created COBOL and some of the programming languages that we base a lot of the things that we're on. So that was kind of my environment, was tech and IT were constantly around, not only just what my dad was doing, but he brought that home. We had computers at my house. I learned how to program BASIC on a TRS 80, the old trash 80 as they used to call them. Died of dysentery on the Oregon Trail several times, I think. So that was kind of my background, and basically, that I think had a huge influence on, eventually getting into the world of broadcasting, but also then into IT and into IT training. A lot of I would say my personality quirks, good, bad, or indifferent, all come from, that kind of a background.
Innovation, creativity, exploration. It seems to me like that was probably one of those dynamics in the household where you were encouraged perhaps to tinker with things. You said you had the machines, you were experimenting with programming, basic, and so on. So is that part of what the household dynamic was like? Just kind of a little bit of freedom, if you will, to explore and try different things and learn different things that way. Was that correct?
Oh, definitely. I think that, one of the biggest things my dad always encouraged me to do, and my mom, was to read and to find out, new things, broaden my horizons. The thing that was, constantly in the background was, you've been born into a world where now technology is, now available. Being a Gen X, guy, we were the ones that pretty much took the internet and helped create the internet and all these things. And so a lot of that was just because of, I think, the background that, a lot of us that, if you talk to people who've done these things, whether they're entrepreneurial or whether they have that military background where, hey, it doesn't work this way, we got to figure out a way around that. And so that was something that was, I would say, constant in my background anyway.
That's very interesting. And as we think about internal auditors, and many of our viewers and listeners will probably be internal auditors, this is one of those attributes that I would like to emphasize. And we've been talking about it quite a bit in the profession in terms of how we need to explore and try different things, right? Even from the formal instruments that we prepare, like risk assessments and audit programs, we have in some cases drifted away. That's just kind of how it used to be with the traditional auditing approach, where you had all these spreadsheets and templates and different things that you will do, and it's very systematic and prescribed in many ways. But what we have basically tried to encourage auditors to do for the last couple of decades at least is to be more broad thinkers as relates to what's going on in the organization and what kinds of risk may be affecting the organization's prospects going forward. So from that perspective, then I think that what you just explained helps again feed into what we are looking for. And some of these things we can train for, but some of these things we probably need to think back about our own upbringing and how that helps to shape the way we think. So I thank you for that. I think that was very helpful, and thank your father too, right? Because for his encouragement and the kind of dynamics that were encouraged around your household. So one of the things that I would like to then know about a little bit about is how do you formally get into IT? So from that kind of organic household experimentation process, how did you then officially formally get into the IT field?
Well, believe it or not, my life was, being in a military family and doing that in the Navy. Your life was pretty much planned out. It was like I was going to join the Navy. I actually had application in, had been accepted all the way through the NROTC program. Was going to go to flight school. I wanted to be an astronaut. I was into science. I was into all those things. And unfortunately, when I hit my DoD physical, they found out something that we just never knew, and I flunked my DoD physical because of a condition that I had that I just didn't know about, and it was a kind of one of those. Well, now what do I do? I mean, when your whole life is pointed to that, how do you
Changes your
respond?
whole
In
direction.
my case, yeah, definitely. And so in my case, the other little thing that I loved was music and radio. Growing up outside of Chicago, I know I'm aging myself here a little bit, but Larry Lou Jack in the morning on WLS. Oh my gosh, I would listen to the Morning Zoo, and I wanted to be like that if I ever had a chance. But so I got into broadcasting. I got into radio, and
Ah,
we had mutual friends that literally kind of welcomed me on and said, hey, come out to the station and just hang out and learn from us. So got my degree in radio and television, but because what we mentioned earlier about how we're in that age of discovery in IT in the early 80s into the 90s just exploded, where now companies, it wasn't just the scientists and the military and the government that had computers. Now businesses had computers, finance had computers, everybody had computers, which is why auditing became such a big thing. And so what we found was, even in broadcasting, there was these automation systems. There were computer systems, nonlinear editing systems. And so as I kind of made my way up the ranks, I had that background. I had and understood IT. I wasn't scared of it. Where you had, the previous generation was like, we're just used to, punching in things and doing things, and these computers, they were scary, and they were kind of afraid of them, but I wasn't. So I dived in, and that's how I got into management. That's how I started becoming an operations manager in the world of that. And one thing about that is you have to obviously learn about software, servers, infrastructure, how things work, how do you connect things. And so, working in that environment and doing those type of things, eventually, unfortunately, broadcasting is not a very stable career. Let's just put it that way. And so, when I had my two children, and I had lost my job again because of management change, and oh, thank you, but we're bringing in our own people. I was actually invited to go be a voice talent for a IT learning company called KnowledgeNet, and this was out in Scottsdale
okay.
back in the late 90s. And so all of a sudden, it was all into the world of certification and project management and IT service management that I had been doing, but I didn't know that there were like certifications, or there were programs that allowed you to do this. I didn't know about frameworks. I was just kind of winging it, as we would say. And so the more I found that, as we talked about, my disciplined, process driven background just kind of latched onto that and said, wow, this is important. And this is how we, as we would say, make IT better.
One of the things that I picked up from what you just mentioned is communication skills. And that's, again, another interesting thing that we have been talking quite a bit in the profession, because most people think about internal auditors and they generally navigate very rapidly towards accounting and finance, financial reporting, and calculating ratios. And those things are very important. We also have another major dynamic playing out in terms of compliance, which of course makes sense. And there's a lot happening there too. But there's a lot more to internal auditing. And we had this whole other uh, area related to IT auditing. So that was, again, very important. And we'll come to that a little bit more because I'm very curious about some of your certifications. But we had integrated auditing and how we started to bring those in. And then, of course, like I was just saying, communication skills. So interesting that you also spend a good amount of time strengthening those skills in your work. So let's talk about certifications, because I am very interested in your profile. And what I've seen is that you have, I think, is A plus, and you have Net Plus certifications. You have ITIL, I believe, as well. You have several certifications. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I used to say I was a certification junkie there for a while. You know, one thing about being in IT training is you have you definitely get a lot of certifications. I've picked up quite a few over the years. Obviously, the CompTIA A plus, Net Plus, Security Plus used to be called iNet Plus. Before it became the Cloud Plus certification back in the day. Worked with Cisco, so I was a Cisco Certified Network Professional, CCNP. I also was a Cisco wireless expert, and so worked with them there. Microsoft, I was an MCSE, Microsoft Certified System Engineer, and that was kind of like the technical side of things. And one thing that happened was they needed someone to teach their PMP class. There was one of the training companies I was working for go, we need someone who's got project management experience, and to take the PMP, you need to have experience and done projects. And we need somebody that really is, just understands that world. And so, my very first project was helping to bring a radio station up from the ground up. So we're talking a $1 million plus project. I was 29, knew nothing of what I was supposed to do, and kind of had to learn as I went. And so I knew the stuff that did work and didn't work, just based on the School of Hard Knocks. But so I got my PMP certification, and then one thing led to another, and I found out about this framework called ITIL. And of course, the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and most people just call it ITIL, which has been around for 30 plus years, developed by the UK government to say it's not about the tech. It's how you use the technology to produce value that matters. And so it was kind of a marriage between the two areas that I was very strong in, or felt strongly about: project management, or process-driven type things, and the technical side of things. We have technology. How do we use this technology to bring value to our customers, whether that's internal customers, fellow employees, or whether that's those external customers that are out there that are buying our products and services? And so that was kind of, out of all the certifications, that was the one that it brought everything together. It was almost like the light bulb went on, the heavens opened up, the light, descends, and you're like, okay, now I see my purpose in life, because this is everything that I've been training for.
It's interesting that you highlighted some things, and I'll come back to those points that are definitely still in my mind from what you just shared with us. So, one of them is that among internal auditors, there are certain certifications. Historically, heavily weighted the CPA, Certified Public Accountant. And because back in the day, a lot of the work was accounting related and financial reporting related and focused. Over time, we have broadened the scope of internal auditors, and the Certified Internal Auditor, CIA, now looks at a lot of other things. In addition to accounting, finance also looks at operations management and risk management, looking in terms of economic dynamics, statistics, a lot of different other fields and topic areas that are important to running organizations effectively. We also have the CISA certification, which you've probably heard of from ISACA and so on, and some of the IT auditors will get those certifications. Then we had others related to fraud. So, what we then found out is that integrating some of these skill sets became very valuable, because as an internal auditor, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to look at, for example, inventory, not realizing that the inventory reports that you rely on, that you're going to use to do your review, are being produced by the computer systems. And not only being produced by the systems, but you also need to understand the algorithm. how is it collecting information, calculating what it needs to calculate, and then produce the reports, who has access to it, who can review, who can view, who can change, all of those dynamics. So the systems become very important. But then again, it is not in isolation. So, what you were just sharing with us in terms of how we look at some of these frameworks and how they are used and how they are usable within the organization so that we can then see the pragmatic, the applied aspect of it is so important. So, let's pick up on ITIL for a moment. I would like to later talk a bit about maybe your network plus and your security plus, because those topics are also very much of interest to me and to a lot of internal auditors. But let's talk about ITIL for a moment. So when we're thinking in terms of that particular framework and how we look at the organization, how it integrates systems and how it integrates into the organization's value creation activities, I will imagine that internal auditors can probably benefit from having that knowledge. Will you believe that? Will you say that that is partly something for them to consider as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's very important for anyone who's going to be, working in the world of auditing, especially from an IT perspective. One thing about IT service management, like we said, like ITIL, for example, which is not the only one that's out there, but it's the most well known, it's the most widely recognized and used. There's others like Verisim and SIAM and several others. But with ITIL, the neat thing is it takes a look at everything that is made up a part of your organization, and it runs it through what they call the service value system. And in that service value system is a key thing that most auditors are going to recognize, something called governance. And so, in other words, as your company, as your organization produces its strategy and produces its tactical and operational processes, one thing that we always want to do is to make sure if we say we're going to do something, or if we have to follow a certain, especially if you work in the world of like government or the military or some of those that are very strictly, I'll use the word, it's not always a good word, but bureaucratically, minded and very process driven, right? Those things are important because as you evaluate and then direct the policies, the guidelines, the controls, there's always that monitoring on the other side, which is where the audit teams come in, whether you internally audit yourself or whether you bring in like a Deloitte or anybody else out there that's KPMG, some of these audit organizations that can come in from the outside and say, all right, you say this is what you're trying to do and this is what you're supposed to do. Let's run through this together. And so by having an ITIL background and understanding things like value streams, understanding things like the difference between your infrastructure and platforms versus something like your software management and development. And then something that a lot of people, in fact, I know at some point you and I discussed, we'll talk about my audit experience, the company that we were working for, where IT asset and software assets became something that almost brought an organization to its knees. And so by knowing these things and by being able to apply these things, utilizing the ITIL framework, that company recovered and actually was able to be hugely successful. And so that all ties into, if you think about it, well, how do we make sure that we're maintaining that? How do we make sure that we are following the governance that we as whether it's the board of directors or whether it's the president for life who owns the company, whoever that upper management person is or that director is, how do we follow through with that? How do we do that? So I think ITIL as I would say a framework and as well as a certification, especially the ITIL 4 Foundation, which is that introductory level, would be amazingly effective for anyone in auditing.
Very, very good. Yes, it provides, from what you're describing and what I know about it, it provides a very comprehensive, very holistic understanding of how all of these pieces come together. And that's a very interesting dynamic within internal audit profession as well, where we're asking internal auditors to have that higher level understanding, have that strategic view of the organization. Quite often people think about the transaction level things that we need to look at, which is also important. But when we're thinking about risk and where we can add value, we also need to think higher level, and strategic dynamic definitely play a very important role. And one of the things that you highlighted just kind of in passing, but I also picked up on that, was how dynamics at the strategic level can bring the organization down. So when we're thinking about what auditors do, you cannot just look at transactions. You need to understand how the big picture also plays a role in the success or failure of the organization, because if it fails at that high level, then nothing else really matters. So all of these things are very important. You mentioned PMP as well, and that's another interesting thing, because in my experience working for different organizations, I was an auditor in insurance. I also worked for professional service organizations over the years, auditing manufacturing, transportation, telecom, utilities, and several others, including government. And we had within our organization, and several of them that I worked over the years, we had several people who were certified PMPs. And this was very, very helpful. And I was able to see that when we're auditing, for example, construction projects and various things like those, where that expertise was very, very valuable in helping to better understand what was happening, what was not happening, what should be happening, and how we could make recommendations to help them out to be more successful. So that is definitely an important piece there. So that's very helpful to us. One of the things I would like to ask you about, and you mentioned governance, and that's a very hot
Yeah.
topic these days as well. So when we're talking about ITIL and some of these other certifications in a broader sense as well. So what is IT governance and what is not IT governance? Are there any misconceptions that we need to know about?
IT governance really is the leadership and the organizational structure from usually whatever your executive team is, setting out the directions, the policies, the guidelines of how an organization is going to fulfill its vision and its strategy. And I mean that's I would say the big high level. Now, of course, when you start breaking that down into the other levels, in which I love what you said, Dr. Hernan, about the that auditors should look at it from a strategic standpoint as well. A big thing in both project management and ITIL is this whole concept of what they call STOW, strategic, tactical to operational. And that governance, in other words, the how we do what we said we're going to do and then make sure that we stick to what we said we're going to do, is an area where a lot of companies, if they're not doing it correctly or if they're not keeping an eye on it, monitoring and evaluating how they've put these things in place and being willing to adjust as necessary once as their company matures or their organization matures, the industry matures, the market, any of those areas, how can you pivot and respond to that? Well, if you have good IT governance set in motion with a team of people that are constantly bringing in auditors saying, okay, number one, are we doing what we said we are? And do you see areas that we can perhaps change or adapt or we need to adjust? Because it might be an area of expertise. I know one thing that, especially in the area of finance, I'll never forget, my first introduction to Sarbanes-Oxley and, what we had to do to help make sure that the finance teams were able to communicate, store, and provide information in ways that follow standard, processes was a big shock to many of the people in the accounting and finance team. So, those are things that I think with IT governance, by having that overarching responsibility, establishment of policy, and then making sure we stick to it, that's what IT governance is.
A big thank you to Chris for his time and for sharing his insight with us. If you're looking for more ways to stay ahead of the curve and earn CPEs, check out Audit Pro TV On Demand, subscription learning for auditors by auditors. Visit acilearning.com/auditprotv.